On behalf of our guests, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Jomo for his willingness to travel to Bangladesh to deliver the CPD Anniversary Lecture. Thank you, Professor Jomo, for your commitment and support towards CPD and Bangladesh. Dear guests, CPD Anniversary Lectures are conceived as interactive events to offer Bangladeshi audience an opportunity to listen to and interconnect with globally renowned scholars and experts on contemporary policy issues of significant relevance to Bangladesh. The CPD Anniversary Lecture 2018 will be delivered this morning by a leading economist and an expert with extensive leadership experience at both national and international levels. Professor Jomo's work on the political economy of development and challenges of SDG implementation have played a vital role in highlighting the issues of developing countries such as Bangladesh. In this respect, the theme of Professor Jomo's anniversary lecture will be a unique opportunity for us to identify the critical challenges of SDG implementation in achieving the goals on food security, affordable energy, and inequality. Professor Jomo's lecture will also help us understand as to how the emerging challenges of malnutrition, obesity, climate change, environmental degradation, energy security, and inequality could be appropriately addressed through concrete global initiatives and national actions. Dear audience, since its founding in 1993, the CPD has been playing a key role in setting the agendas through evidence-based research and policy influencing. The objective of CPD Anniversary Lectures are to give Bangladeshi audience, key policymakers and stakeholders an exposure to frontier thinking and contemporary research-related issues that are important to developing countries. The tradition of anniversary lectures by CPD was established in November 2014 to coincide with the 20th founding anniversary of CPD. I take this opportunity to recall the speakers and themes of previous lectures. The first anniversary lecture was delivered by Professor Luca Katsili, eminent scholar and former Minister of Greece. Her lecture was titled Recent Fiscal and Labour Market Adjustment Experiences in Europe, Lessons for the Low-Income Countries. The second anniversary lecture was delivered by Mr. Simon Maxwell, CBE, Executive Chair of Climate and Development Knowledge Network, Chair European Think Tanks Group, and former Director of the Overseas Development Institute in London, on the theme of climate-compatible development, pathways or pipe dream. Dr. Sakiko Fukuda-Par from New School, New York, delivered the third anniversary lecture on health and global trade regime. Is it affecting equal access to medicine? Dear guests, this year's anniversary theme is pertinent to the SDGs, which have set 17 goals and 169 challenging targets. Among these goals, food, energy, inequality are critically important, not only for Bangladesh, but for the world as a whole. Sustainable food systems, employment, decent work, energy security, and social protection pose challenges for both developing and developed world. We reckon that analytical insights of Professor Jomo, informed by his vast international experience, will greatly help us to reassess these issues and devise relevant policy towards delivering the SDGs on food, energy, and inequality. We have a very enlightened group of participants this morning, which include policymakers, experts, academics, diplomats, representatives of the business community, private sector, the media, civil society organizations, non-government organizations, and development partners. Esteemed guests, it is my pleasure now to invite our distinguished fellow, Professor Mustafizur Rahman, to introduce our anniversary guest, Professor Jomo. Thank you.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends from the media, dear guests, A very good morning. It is my distinct privilege to introduce the eminent personality who will deliver the CPD Anniversary Lecture 2018, the fourth one, but very special in this particular year that coincides with the CPD celebration of 25 years of its foundation in 1993. We are extremely honored to have the presence of someone of the stature of our speaker of today to deliver the Anniversary Lecture 2018 this morning. Dear guests, our speaker today is a person who combines the unique qualities of exceptional scholarship, institution builder, public service at the highest global level, and role model as a public intellectual committed to the betterment of his country and his people. Our speaker's academic credentials are indeed impeccable. He was educated at Yale and Harvard, to which he subsequently returned to teach at various points in time. He carried out research as a visiting fellow at Cambridge University and Singapore National University. He taught at the University of Malaya, where he was professor in the Applied Economics Department, and also at the University of Malaysia and at Cornell University, USA. He was founder director of the Institute of Social Sciences between 1978 and 2004, and founder chairman of International Development Economics Associates, where he now serves as on the advisory panel. He has authored and edited over 100 books and translated 12 volumes. He published in globally reputed journals and authored highly acclaimed and frequently cited books, including Tigers in Trouble, Financial Governance, Liberalization, and Crisis in East Asia, Policy Matters, Economic and Social Policies to Sustain Equitable Development, Flat World, Big Gaps, Economic Liberalization, Poverty and Inequality. Is good governance good for development? Ending malnutrition, from commitment to action. Malaysian eclipse, economic crisis and recovery. From recovery. Malaysian industrial policy and Malaysia at 50, development, distribution and disparities. As a recognition of his unique contribution in advancing the frontiers of economic thought, he was awarded the prestigious Vasily Leontiev Prize in 2007. As an international civil servant, our speaker held the high office of the UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, between 2005 and 2012. His role in this capacity and his exceptional contributions during his tenure as Under Secretary General in advancing the interests of the developing countries received high appreciation and wide recognition. Indeed, under his stewardship, UNDESA went on to achieve newer heights of excellence both in terms of quality of the academic work on development issues, as also for the policy and practical support extended to the developing countries. He also served as research coordinator for the G24 Intergovernmental Group on International Monetary Affairs and Development, and as Assistant Director General of Economic and Social Development, Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, of the United Nations. He was also a member of the Stiglitz Commission of Experts on Reforms of the International Monetary and Financial System. Currently, he is visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University, and adjunct professor at the International Islamic University of Malaysia. Dear friends, our anniversary speaker is someone whose commitment to his motherland, Malaysia, inspired him to be actively involved in the debates and discussions concerning the future of his country. A highly acclaimed public intellectual, in his popular writings one does not fail to notice that his heart is always in the right place, upholding the interests of the marginalized and those who are left behind. These progressive causes he advocated most strongly when he was president of Malaysian Social Science Association during 1996-2000 and as founding convener of the International Malaysian Studies Convention in 1997 and 1999. The recent developments in Malaysia have created new opportunities for him to contribute to the changing policies his country is trying to pursue by shaping and sharpening the causes that he believes in. Following the 14th general elections in Malaysia on 9th of May this year and the change of guard in his country, he is currently serving as a distinguished member of the group of elders. Dear friends, above and beyond what I have said, which does not do justice to the person I have been asked to introduce, there is a special place in our hearts for our anniversary speaker. He has always been a well-wisher of the CPD since the very first days of its founding by Professor Rehman Sobhan. Whenever Professor Sobhan had sought his participation at CPD events and collaboration with CPD activities, our speaker had always extended his fullest support, always ready to go the extra leg to be with us. For this, we remain especially grateful to him, and today is indeed an opportunity to express our sincere and heartfelt appreciation of this unwavering support and friendship. Our speaker also readily agreed when, as advised by Professor Rehman Sobhan, Dr. Devapriya Bhattacharya, Distinguished Fellow CPD, and Dr. Famida Khatun, our Executive Director, approached him to deliver the anniversary lecture for this, our special year of foundation. Today, he will share his thoughts on a theme which is so critically important for us in Bangladesh, issues of food, energy, and inequality in the era of implementing the SDGs. We are all eagerly looking forward to listen to and learn from his ideas on these very relevant and pertinent issues. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it has been my distinct honor to have introduced a very distinguished speaker who will deliver the 4th CPD Anniversary Lecture this morning, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Thank you. It is my distinct honor to invite Professor Jomo to give his speech. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning to all. Thank you very much for your presence here today, but it will take me a long time to express my appreciation to all concerned. So allow me to dispense with all the usual salutations by using a West African import, all protocols observed. Now, having said that, however, I think I must say two things, to thank two people in particular. Dr. Famida, of course, has been very, very important in making all the preparations, and I particularly appreciate her patience with all the rather detailed requests I had to make. And of course, to Rehman Sobhan, who is now chairing the session today. He has been especially important. We have been friends for many, many decades, more than he might want to remember. And his work was especially influential and important in the early years of the assault on public enterprises. And this, I think, was very important for us to remember. The kinds of critique he offered at that time was quite different from the critique offered by Mrs. Thatcher. Now, having said this, I think it's important for us to recognize that CPD celebrates its silver anniversary this year, and it is with considerable record of success and influence. This is the second time I've spoken at a CPD function of this type, and the first time was in 1995, I think it was, 96. When we were debating the World Bank's new report at that time called Bureaucrats in Business. And we have come a very long way since then. Even the early advocates of privatization no longer insist on privatization, and we have a much more complex and subtle debate than ever before. Now, having said all this, let me turn quickly to the subject of today's discussion, because I know that time is limited. We are slightly already behind schedule, and these are very major subjects, food, energy, and inequality. I'm going to run through many slides. I have many slides, and basically make an argument in relation to these issues. I have been advocating for some time that this month, of course, as you know, marks the 10th anniversary of the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers, the beginning of what has been politely called the Great Recession. And this, I think, is important for us to remember, that rather than learning the lessons which led to that crisis, we have in fact avoided some of the major issues, and now we find ourselves in a situation where there is a great deal of vulnerability, particularly in some of the so-called emerging market economies, most notably, of course, Argentina and Turkey. But I can assure you that there is a tendency when contagion occurs for it to spread regardless of boundaries. There is a very simplistic perception, and I experienced this firsthand during the Asian crisis 21 years ago, that although the nature of Malaysia's financial situation was quite different from neighboring Indonesia and Thailand, for those investing in markets, the call was sell Asia, sell Southeast Asia. So they couldn't distinguish. A country like the Philippines, which had very poor credit ratings and hence did not borrow very much, it too was adversely affected by this kind of perception. Now, when we talked about these kinds of issues at that time, we were described as being recalcitrant, as not understanding how sophisticated financial markets are, and so on. Now, the Nobel Committee, in its wisdom, I'm not sure about the wisdom, but tried to reconcile this by giving a Nobel Prize to two people with completely different views several years ago. And without going into the details of this, I think it is very important for us to begin to realize that the world of knowledge, the world of ideas, including the world of economics, unfortunately, has to stand up to much, much more rigorous testing in the world in which we live. So, having emphasized how crucial it is for us to draw the correct lessons, I want to emphasize this because at the time of the crisis, only because the UN had been calling for vigilance, and it was very concerned about the developments which were building up to the 2008 crisis. What happened was that we were able at that time to have more influence than usual. And this greater influence manifested itself in different ways, and we were a major player. In fact, when then President Sarkozy wanted to organize the first G20 meeting at the summit level, he wanted to organize it at the UN. But President Bush at that time called him up and said, no, not at the UN, I'll host it here in the White House. And so the first G20 meeting at the summit level was actually held at the White House under these circumstances. The preference was to have it at the UN, not at the World Bank, not at the IMF, because it was the UN which had warned about the factors which were developing. Unfortunately, that moment when the UN had a certain degree of influence passed fairly shortly thereafter, as financial lobbyists insisted that the green shoots of recovery in 2009, after some Keynesian measures were introduced, these so-called green shoots of recovery proved that the system was fine, and therefore there was no need for radical reforms. One of the major calls we made at the UN, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called for a global Green New Deal. A global Green New Deal. Now, immediately, Prime Minister Gordon Brown called up Secretary General Ban and said to him, please don't say anything more about this. I'll come over to New York and talk to you more. And he came over and he told us that please don't raise expectations too high, because we were calling for $1 trillion fiscal stimulus. But what was global about it? That the stimulus would go to the least developed countries especially. And the whole idea was to accelerate the transition, particularly the energy transition. And the idea was to leapfrog the fossil fuel stage and go straight to renewable energy. And this was possible in our view for a number of reasons which I won't get into right now, but I'll talk about later. And the other thing, of course, was to address, at that time, you may remember, in 2008, food prices peaked. Wheat prices and rice price went up very, very high due to a number of reasons which I won't get into right now. But it is important to recognize that there was this sense of food insecurity at that moment. And so what we did was to call for a global Green New Deal to address particularly the questions of food insecurity and global warming by bypassing, by making possible, by delivering electricity to all the people of the world. There are more than 1 billion people in the world who do not have access to modern energy, who do not have access to electricity. And the idea was to make this possible, but not to go through the fossil fuel stage and to go straight to renewable energy. That was our call, and I still believe, unfortunately, because nothing was done, that this is still relevant. Eventually, to be fair to Prime Minister Gordon Brown, he did raise not 1 trillion, he raised 1.1 trillion, but 80% of it went to the IMF. And that money was not for developing countries. It was basically been used mainly to bail out the European economies which have been running into problems recently. So if you want to think about where the money came from, that money which was meant for developing countries went to European countries precisely for this reason. Now, so I think it is important for us to reflect critically on paths not taken, precisely because those paths, those options are still available. And in the current situation in which we face in the world today, these choices are still very relevant. Let me now move very quickly to reminding you a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, there are 3 elements: economic development, social progress, and environmental or resource sustainability. There are 17 goals, as you know, and over almost 170 targets covering these various dimensions. I won't get into them in great detail. They are up here on the slide for your attention. And I particularly have highlighted a few, but I want to emphasize those relating to my concerns. I think one of the major issues which we face in the world today is not just the question of hunger, which is still very relevant, unfortunately, for almost 1 billion people who do not have enough food to eat on a daily basis. But besides that question, we have a growing problem of, as people have become better off, as other people have become better off, they are suffering now from problems of malnutrition, which are to some extent seemingly self-inflicted, because people make choices about what they eat and so on and so forth. And this, of course, raises very, very serious problems. And this is why I want to raise the question of food and some of the other issues. Now, I'm just putting up the different goals for your attention. Now, it is very important to recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals involve a balance between these 3 dimensions which I mentioned earlier. And so, among other things, besides the question of food, obviously, as you know, Bangladesh, I don't think, is one of those countries where you're very, very sensitive to the problem of global warming, precisely because of the situation you're in, being relatively low-lying. Much of the country is very low-lying, and the likelihood of sea levels rising has very, very profound implications, not only for the future of the country, the future of agriculture, and the future of the people's well-being. Now, let me focus now on questions of malnutrition. I think, as you know, there are 3 dimensions of malnutrition which I think is useful for us to consider. One dimension, which is well known, of course, is the whole question of hunger, of whether or not people get enough macronutrients. By the way, just as a matter of information, the POI, POU, the prevalence of undernutrition indicator of the FAO, which I was very much involved in supervising the work on during the time I was with the FAO, that indicator is really an indicator of chronic hunger. Okay? You basically need to be chronically hungry, not just say, seasonally, just before the harvest, for example, or something like that. You have to be chronically hungry to be considered hungry by the POU standard. So it tends to be an underestimate rather than an overestimate of hunger. And this issue, unfortunately, is still very much with us. So despite the ostensible decline in poverty numbers, which you see all the time, in fact, hunger remains a crucial issue, as we will see in a moment. The next issue, which I think is extremely important for us to consider, are micronutrient deficiencies. And micronutrients basically vitamins, minerals, and trace elements, which are all very important. Now, our needs change over time, and they are different by gender. Women, for example, particularly during the time of menses, require much more blood iron for their needs. And likewise, what is a child, what an unborn baby needs when in the mother's womb and during the first 2 years after birth are quite different from what is needed at the age of 6 and what is needed at the age of 60. So needs change over time, and it's very important for us to recognize this. And the popular term used is hidden hunger, because you might feel you're full, but in fact you are deprived of micronutrients, and it's important for us to recognize this. The third element are what are called NCDs, non-communicable diseases, and these are particularly, we should pay attention to those which are diet related. And there are many problems. There is a tendency in many countries, in many societies, to focus on overweight and obesity, and this is understandable because it imposes huge costs, and the costs are very, very high for certain societies. But in fact, there are a whole range of diet-related non-communicable diseases. Somebody can be diabetic, and may not be obese, may not be overweight, but the person is diabetic. And we are not just talking about type 1 diabetes, which might be inherited, but also type 2 diabetes, which might be acquired due to lifestyles and so on. So all this is very important and there are a whole range of other diet-related NCDs, which I have not even mentioned. So all this has important implications. It affects our human development. It affects our life chances. It affects productivity, and so on and so forth. So it is very important for us to recognize the totality of the challenge of nutrition. Now, today there are still over 800 million people, okay, which is well over 10% of the world's population who remain hungry. The figure I have in this slide has not been updated, but it's also important to recognize that over 2 billion people out of 7.5 billion people in the world today suffer micronutrient deficiencies. There are many children who remain stunted and who are wasted and underweight, and there are a great number of deaths. Almost half of child deaths annually are due to malnutrition. There are also, on the other hand, children who are overweight. In my country, there are three major cultures: the ethnic Malays, ethnic Chinese, ethnic Indians. But when a child is overweight and heavy, in each culture, they all say that child is healthy, when in fact the converse is true. The reason for this is understandable, because three generations ago, an emaciated-looking child was considered unhealthy. So somebody who's slightly overweight is considered healthy. But in fact, we find ourselves, we are under some kind of self-delusion. Now, it is the current estimates of the number of overweight people is well over 2 billion. In other words, we are talking about 30% of the world's population, world's adult population is overweight. And there are about 700 million people who are, at least 700 million people who are estimated to be obese. Okay? And so this is a very serious challenge. Now, allow me to to look specifically at the question, the POU, the prevalence of undernourishment numbers. And I want to draw your attention to the Bangladesh situation. Sadly, Bangladesh made progress in the last decade, and that progress seems to have been reversed. That line refers to Bangladesh, the line which rises. In other words, the number of hungry people in Bangladesh actually increased. The proportion of hungry people, sorry, not the number, the proportion of hungry people. And since the population is increasing, the number has also been increased. Now, you may say, well, the FAO has got it wrong and so on and so forth, but I think this is a matter of concern. I would be the first, having been responsible for these numbers, to point out that these are estimates. These are estimates because there's no other way of doing it. You can't go around the country and do a census to try to determine these kinds of questions. Census costs a lot of money. These are estimates. But it should be a matter of concern that whereas in other parts of the country, of the world, and also other parts of South Asia, where progress has been decent since the middle of the last decade, we have seen an increase in Bangladesh. Other types of malnutrition are still very, very widespread. I'm just going to run through a few quick slides to give you some sense of the numbers. Undernutrition, particularly among children, stunting, underweight, wasting, severe wasting indicators have all made some progress, but the progress is nothing to be terribly proud of. There is also, as I emphasized earlier, a great deal of problems with what I call micronutrient deficiencies. A lot of this is related to lifestyle. Moving from the countryside to the urban areas, you have less access to vegetables, less access to fruits. Many micronutrients are to be found in such food, and so all this affects. The more processed the food is, the less the more likely that those things are, the food is to be devoid of micronutrients. I'll give you a simple example because I used to be in a military college in my own country. In our country, we were very much, as you know, when the British first came to rule Malaya, they came from the Bengal presidency. During the days of the East India Company, the Bengal presidency. And so in Malaysia, there are often references to Bengalis. Okay? But who are these Bengalis? A Bengali in the Malaysian public mind is actually a Sikh. Okay? Now, how did Sikhs become Bengalis? Because the East India Company used so-called martial races. They used the Punjabis. And why were Punjabis considered to be better soldiers and tall and so on and so forth? Because they were eating chapatis. Okay? And chapati, you do not separate the wheat germ from the wheat. And atta flour has better nutritional implications. Okay? In Malaysia, 90 years ago, a study found that almost no Malays suffered from beriberi, ethnic Malays. No Indians, a few of them suffered from beriberi. The vast majority ate parboiled rice. The Chinese had the highest incidence of beriberi. Why? Because they were eating polished white rice. What is the pattern of consumption of rice today in Malaysia? Everybody eats white rice. Have we progressed or have we regressed? Okay? So these are questions which we need to ask ourselves. They are not easy questions to deal with. Problems of anemia are still serious. Vitamin A deficiency, iodine deficiency affects gout and various other problems. And what I think is very important to recognize that women and children tend to be the ones who suffer most from malnutrition, particularly from nutritional deprivations of different types. Now, I mentioned earlier that economic costs. People unfortunately, do not like to consider a problem until there's some ostensible economic implication, some economic cost. And I think this is very, very dangerous and misleading. Because how do you measure the cost of certain things, you know? The fact that it is cheaper to be ill in Bangladesh than to be ill in the United States. Does that make it less problematic in Bangladesh? No, obviously not. Okay, so you begin to see that the economic valuation of many problems is very, very misleading and dangerously misleading. But for what it is worth, it has been estimated that malnutrition contributes about 5%, costs about 5% of world GDP. Okay? And this is not a trivial amount by any standards. Now, specifically on obesity, the McKinsey Global Institute did a study which was published just before the second International Conference on Nutrition, which I was involved in organizing in Rome in 2014. And the numbers of people, they estimated 2.1 billion people who are about 2 billion people overweight, which is about 30% of the global population. But just to give you a sense of how serious the problem is, we're not talking about all types of malnutrition. It is the third largest burden on humanity. Armed conflicts cost 2.1 trillion. Smoking costs another 2.1 trillion. Obesity costs 2.0 trillion. This is McKinsey Global Institute's estimate. So we're not talking, and that is just for obesity alone. Consider the other nutritional deprivations and their implications. So the costs of malnutrition are actually very, very serious, except they do not get much attention that they deserve. Meanwhile, of course, we find that, I don't like to use the term overnutrition, but many people like to use this. And so you have problems of overweight and obesity growing fast. But where are they growing fastest? In developing countries. They're growing fastest in the so-called emerging markets. The faster the growth rate, the more likely overweight and obesity is to grow. Some of you may remember that in the year 2000, the Mexican president, for about 70 years, the Institutional Revolutionary Party had ruled Mexico. In 2000, they lost the election. The first post-PRI is the name of the Institutional Revolutionary Party in Spanish, the acronym. The first post-PRI president was previously the president of Coca-Cola Mexico. Okay? So you can imagine the measures he took. And within a couple of years, Mexico's problems in terms of obesity exceeded the US. The number of people who are suffering exceeded the US. Now, the top 5 in the world are all from Central America. Okay? In Asia, I'm very sad to tell you this, my own country, Malaysia, is now number 1 in Asia. Okay? Leaving aside the South Pacific. We are also number 1 in terms of diabetes. Okay? All avoidable problems. And what has the government done? Until recently, the government has been subsidizing sugar consumption. Okay? Now, even banning sugar, I mean, you can't ban sugar consumption, but, trying to, not subsidizing is not enough of a measure. But this is a problem. Okay, so we find that sugar is added to all kinds of good food, including food which is fed to young children to develop new habits. Okay? I still remember with great appreciation that every year in school sports day, we would get a overly sweet Milo drink. Yeah? Very, very sweet. And we would love it. and we all craved to have more Milo. You know, that is the kind of promotion which goes on. I'm sure there are similar things which go on in other societies as well. So the problem of nutrition transition is a very, very serious problem, and there will obviously involve changing diets and changing lifestyles ultimately. I want to emphasize that the 3 dimensions of malnutrition which I talked about before are not mutually exclusive. The 3 dimensions actually overlap a great deal. And unfortunately, there are about 16 countries in the world where you have all 3 dimensions of malnutrition present. But the number of countries where you have micronutrient problems, or particularly in children, stunting problems in children, adult obesity problems are actually very, very considerable. Now, basically, I think it is important for us to find new ways to address the problem of nutrition. And it's important for governments to take a much, much more proactive view. And this problem cannot be dealt with by ministries of health alone. There has to be an all-of-government approach to addressing this. And this includes questions such as social protection to ensure that people are better off. If you look at the provision of food in India, okay, India has a scheme where they provide food. When mothers, women were asked whether they would prefer cash or food, more than 90% opted for food, because the cash is fungible, and it is possible that fathers might use the cash for other purposes, whereas with food it's very difficult to go and resell the food and so on. So women generally chose food. So organizing social protection schemes, for example, and recognizing this is very, very important. I know it is now very, very popular in certain parts of the world, in certain circles, to say, oh, conditional cash transfers are the way forward and so on. Well, there are huge problems, as I've pointed out in some of the work which we did at the UN, but I think it's very important to recognize that food is important, and women especially appreciate food transfers rather than cash transfers much more. Let me now turn to climate. I think you all know, people, I don't need to persuade you in Bangladesh about the importance of global warming. Okay? It's like taking coals to Newcastle. I don't need to do that. And it's a very, very serious problem, and unfortunately there is no political will. Let me remind you that the Paris deal, was essentially a voluntary deal. There is no firm commitment which governments are made. So I think there's a lot of fuss about Paris as a great achievement. In fact, it was a very, very modest achievement. There were far more serious commitments made in Kyoto, what is called the Kyoto Protocol. But unfortunately, the developed countries have ignored the Kyoto Protocol. There are very, very few countries, only a few in Europe, which have actually met the targets, the commitments they made in the Kyoto Protocol. But now nobody talks about the Kyoto Protocol. They all talk about Paris. But Paris is essentially voluntary. You cannot hold governments, you cannot hold countries to those commitments made in Paris, because they are essentially voluntary commitments. And this was all President Obama could deliver, because he knew how politically problematic it would have been. I just remind you that after the Kyoto Protocol was signed, the U.S. Senate, rejected it. 95 votes to 0. 0 votes for the Kyoto Protocol, 95 against. So some of you may say, well, something is better than nothing. Unfortunately, something is not enough in these circumstances. Now, looking at the situation now, I think we have a dilemma. On the one hand, fossil fuel energy generation is considered necessary, desirable for many people. Poor people all over the world aspire to have modern energy. They do not shun modern energy. How many people do you know of who shun modern energy? They aspire for that. And we know that energy consumption is strongly correlated with human development indicators. But we also know that there is a very strong correlation between energy generation, economic growth, carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. This is the dilemma which we face. The damage to developing countries is far, far greater than the damage to the rich countries. But the problem was that renewable energy, generally speaking, remains more expensive. Okay? Of course, when the price of petrol went down very low, of course it was no longer more expensive. But we cannot wait for those very contingent circumstances. How do we overcome this problem? Thankfully, the cost of renewable energy, and particularly two types of renewable energy, photovoltaic solar panels and wind turbines, has come down tremendously. But not all countries have a lot of wind. In Malaysia, for example, there are parts of the country where you do not have enough wind to make it possible. So for those of us, particularly in the equatorial tropical belt, the most viable option really are photovoltaic solar panels. And the price has come down tremendously. And it's not a new development. So if you look at the costs and look at them very carefully, you will find, for example, that the PV, photovoltaic, okay, because there are different types of solar energy, okay, but photovoltaic particularly has come down tremendously. And it is very unlikely that it can go down much more because of you can get more productivity perhaps, but it's very unlikely to go down significantly more. So even without subsidization, it is feasible to introduce and promote solar energy, especially when the price of petroleum goes up. And in this country, I understand, you used to have, I don't know whether you still have, a huge subsidy for petrol, which we in the middle class all enjoy. Okay? But is it necessarily desirable? So, this is just to give you an indication of how much the price of photovoltaic cells has come down. Okay? And you can see that by the beginning of this decade, there's almost very little room for further decline. Okay? There's very, very little room for further decline. Okay? So, there has to be a determined push for photovoltaic. So our basic argument is very simple. Have a big push, upfront investments, and there will be long-term savings in terms of investments. So if you look at the brown bars, the brown bar basically refers to the green bar the green bars basically are the consequences of if you make a significant commitment. Okay, so you have a bigger, the green bar is slightly higher on the left, and in the longer term, that means until the end of this century, you require much, much less investment because of a determined push at the beginning. This was what we were calling for a decade ago. Okay, unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears. Now, it is true that many of the patents are controlled by developed countries. But I can assure you that particularly with photovoltaic solar panels, this is not really a problem. Malaysia happens to be the single largest exporter of solar panels to the US. We export twice as much as China. And the reason is very simple, because there are a lot of restrictions on importing solar panels from China. So Malaysia has become number one. But there's absolutely no reason why Bangladesh cannot become a major solar panel producer. Not only for Bangladeshi needs, but also for export. You have all the necessary ingredients, and you also have tremendous human resources. Okay? So I leave that thought with you, because I think it is extremely important. But if we are going to reduce emissions in the world, we really need a strong investment-led approach. Investments must be front-loaded. There are tremendous. This is not a technology which is so complicated that there's no prospect of Bangladeshis mastering it. And public investments, I believe, can be structured in such a way as to crowd in private investments to make the necessary progress. This, I think, is the major challenge for countries in the world, countries in the developing world as a whole, but especially for Bangladesh because of the threat climate change poses for Bangladesh. So the implications are very, very great. Unfortunately, I would argue that you cannot rely on markets alone to solve this problem. Governments need to intervene. There needs to be some collective action, but particularly national governments can do a lot to make progress. You obviously need much more R&D, and you also need some more flexibility in IPR rules. So what has happened, for example, with the public health exception, and Bangladesh has been very successful in building a generic pharmaceutical industry from this public health exception. And I wanted during this trip to meet Dr. Zafrullah Chowdhury, because he was very instrumental in getting this going in the WHO over 4 decades ago. This is a very, very important development. So the two largest producers of generic pharmaceuticals and exporters as well are actually India and Bangladesh. Okay? This is a very, very important development. Now, they're not very expensive. So it doesn't show up as a huge thing in your export figures. Okay? But just consider how many people you are making better off. Now, as you graduate, as you no longer become an LDC, there will be a lot of pressure to cut off these kinds of options which you now currently enjoy. And it's very important, therefore, in planning the transition to ensure that what Bangladesh has achieved is not lost and, in fact, becomes the basis for continuing to progress and develop. Let me now turn very quickly to the third part of what I wanted to say. I think it's important for us to consider inequality at the world scale. Inequality, according to the late Angus Maddison, who was a famous economic historian, he claims that the world inequality between different parts of the world, between different regions of the world, was actually quite low before about 500 years ago. And 500 years ago, with the beginnings of European colonialism, inequalities increased slightly. But the big increase began about 2 centuries ago with the Industrial Revolution. And then there was some reversal, and the main reversal was during the interwar period, partly because of the Depression. The Depression brought an end to the so-called Gilded Age, okay, of excessive wealth. For those of you who read English literature, for example, of The Great Gatsby and so on and so forth, all that came to an end. Okay, so the extreme wealth at the top end came to an end, and the workers' movements and others, what are now often derided as populist movements and so on, demanded and ensured that the people at the bottom were also better off. And then, of course, after the war, with decolonization and developing countries decolonized developing countries being able to grow faster than under colonial rule, you began to see some decline in inequality during what has often been referred to as the post-war golden age, from the 40s until the 70s. This unfortunately came to an end, and global inequalities have increased until fairly recently. This graph basically ends at the end of the 20th century, and I would say that global inequalities have come down since then for other reasons. This is an attempt at a three-dimensional chart. Okay, you have to forgive my amateur attempt at doing so. On the left, on the x-axis, are rich people. On the right, on the x-axis, are poorer people. Okay? Poor countries are in front on the, okay, if you look at the diagonal now, poor countries are in front and rich countries are behind. So the skyscraper in the far corner refers to rich people in rich countries. And the people, the vast majority of people whom you cannot see are basically in front. They do not register on this three-dimensional thing, are basically poor people in poor countries. Okay? Now, inequalities unfortunately have continued to increase at least until the end of the 20th century. If you take the 20 poorest countries, including, these numbers include Bangladesh by the way, you find that the increase was about, of income over 4 decades was about 25%. Rich countries, however, almost tripled their incomes. Okay? Now, there is growing recognition, even from the IMF, that inequality slows economic growth. Okay? Now, we all know the story of commodity prices. Many of us in this room have been concerned about it. And of course, in the case of Bangladesh, an industry has almost disappeared, the jute industry, and has been reinventing itself in new ways, but, with limited success. Okay? In Malaysia got, the tin industry collapsed in the 80s. When the Americans under Reagan released its tin stockpile. And in the case of rubber, prices have never really recovered since the late 50s, after the mass utilization of synthetic rubber. But Malaysia has successfully made a switch to oil palm. Okay? So you will find that Malaysia's success is actually largely imported, because almost everything we grow and export, except durians, are actually foreign plants. Rubber, Hevia brasiliensis, comes from Brazil. Smuggled out. If you go to the mouth of the river Amazon, in the town of Belém, you will find a small natural history museum. And you will see a pathetic-looking rubber plant inside it, and an inscription. This is the plant which was stolen by the British imperialists to create their empire in Asia. Okay? And so on and so forth. Okay? So this is you talk about intellectual property rights. Okay? This is how empires were built. Okay? So, if we look at commodity prices have gone up and down, and many of our economies have been very much affected by them. As far as manufacturers are concerned, Bangladesh has been very, very successful in exporting garments and other manufactured products. I want to emphasize pharmaceuticals, although it does not figure very, very largely because of its importance to other poor countries. Those are very, very much appreciated. And you can see that the products of developing countries have also declined, the prices of manufacturers. So when the garments which you are producing were once produced by Malaysia long ago, say about 4 decades ago, we were probably getting a slightly better price. And then to push the price down, these companies went to places like China and then eventually Bangladesh. That is the history of it. Okay? So when you can successfully able to produce these manufactured goods, you find that these manufactured goods tend to become, their prices tend to decline. Okay? Meanwhile, of course, the more sophisticated manufactured goods which are produced by the richer countries do not suffer the same pressure, because you have intellectual property rights which protect monopolies by individual companies. That is the essence of an intellectual property right, a publicly acknowledged monopoly. So, meanwhile, you also have the situation of financial globalization, which has wreaked havoc, in my view, and continues to wreak havoc. We've had a major crisis in many parts of the world 2 decades ago, another major crisis a decade ago, and if the situation does not improve, we may well face a new international financial crisis very shortly. Throughout this period, it's important to note that there has been a net transfer of financial resources from south to north. What the Nobel laureate who was calling for this has called capital flowing uphill. Because the theory, the justification for it was reduce the barriers to finance, to flows of finance across borders. And when you open it up, finance will flow from the capital rich to the capital poor countries. The evidence, however, is precisely the reverse. Finance has flowed from the poor countries to the rich countries. These are not my numbers. These are from the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF. Okay? There was an economist in Malaysia who's passed away many years ago. He said, the logic of this is like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out. Okay? Now, where has the capital flowed to? Well, about half of it has actually flowed to the US. Okay? For various reasons which I won't get into right now. And there has been a great deal of illicit financial flows, often related to trade mispricing, or what used to be called transfer pricing in the old days. And the second thing, of course, is tax evasion. So, friends, I think what we face in the world today is a very formidable problem. And I think we are in a situation where it is very unlikely that there will be the kind of collective action by the South which you saw briefly during the 1970s. And so what we are stuck with is trying to make the best of the situation which we face. And I would strongly recommend that for a country like Bangladesh, you pay attention to 2 issues. One, the question of food, and not leave the problem of nutrition entirely to the Ministry of Health, but recognize that nutrition is multidimensional, and the production and distribution of food is very, very important. Part of the reason why I encourage much more work on food is not only because I love food, but also, it's not for nothing that the FAO headquarters is in Italy. Yeah? But there's also something else to consider besides There are many, many issues now which are very serious issues which often we do not even recognize. The use of herbicides, the use of other chemicals, agrochemicals. It compromises food safety. We are all consuming that food. And our bodies are going to be affected by this sooner or later. In many countries, unfortunately, the only time we ever learn about this is when our food exports are rejected by other countries. Okay? Most of the time, we don't pay enough attention to this. But unfortunately, it has very, very profound effects on our well-being. The second reason, of course, I need not emphasize, is the challenge of global warming. All too many countries, sadly including my own, have turned, instead of making progress from diesel to renewable energy, we have regressed from diesel to coal-fired plants. This is the situation in the world today. It's not even because coal is much cheaper. But now, the world has changed. And only with strong government leadership involving the private sector are we going to be able to make the progress in terms of promoting renewable energy and ensuring that the entire population of Bangladesh and the entire population of the world actually has access to modern energy in an affordable way. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear guests, on behalf of all of you, once again our deep gratitude to Professor Jomo for that excellent deliberation on very important and pertinent issues. We have, as our Executive Director had already mentioned, a very diverse and rich audience, including development economists, practitioners, development partners, and we are hoping that there will be, we will have some time for a discussion. Professor Jomo has very kindly agreed to respond to some of your queries, share his thoughts further. So I would like to open the floor, and please introduce yourself and please put your question. Atik Bhai, would you like to? Many of the issues which Professor Jomo has mentioned, nutrition, energy and climate change, you have been working on these issues for quite a long time, and you are one of our eminent specialists in this area. So, please.
I wasn't planning to initiate the discussion because it has been so beautifully wide and intense and consistent that my special congratulations to Professor Jomo for this very elucidating presentation. I take food energy inequality in just giving a couple of examples to supplement some of the things that you said, particularly energy stroke climate change, where the game is getting far more complicated, as you rightly say. Kyoto has not died yet, but Kyoto is put into the mortuary while Paris is going to give out. On the food issue, critically, one of the biggest crises for the planet for food is that 1/3 of all the food we produce is being wasted. We do not use it. So we use all the fertilizers, all the water, all the money, all the investment, and the greenhouse gas associated with it in producing it. Then we take it to the fridge in the Western world and then throw it away. And the developing world, we try to take it from the field to the storage. And either in the storage or in the path, we destroy about not 1/3, less than that. But the rich people destroy more than 1/3 of the food they buy. So this is a major moral, economic, and climate crisis that we've got in our hand. So I will not go too much into the food. Your point about micronutrition. In Bangladesh, serious issues of the absence of fluoride, Absence of zinc is a serious problem for one major issues of diarrheal diseases now is being talked about, fortifying our rice production through the genetic combination to put in zinc into the system, which has already made significant progress. So there are some opportunities already out there. I will not go far more detail in the food. In the 80s and the 90s, I used to give a series of lectures on global food crisis. And when the lecture had to be public, I had to transform it, said, why we eat. And there are many reasons, at least 6 major reasons why we eat. One is nutrition, one is filling the stomach. So there are many other reasons. As to the energy and the climate, I totally agree with you. Bangladesh is in the forefront of photovoltaic revolution. I had the privilege of starting that, but now 4.8 million poor households have PV in their system, and more than 20 million people are directly beneficiary of 4 to 6 hours of lighting in the evening, which changes their lifestyle totally, increases participation of the children in education, particularly girl child into education, and a number of very positive things. However, this is in terms of wattage, it is tiny. So how do you make that into going into the main front, because our policymakers think in some megawatts. It has implication in terms of how many people it covers and etc. If we produce conventional megawatts and subsidize all that, we are just draining money into it. On the other hand, renewable will give us hope, and Bangladesh is making some serious progress in this area. However, getting into the field of commercialization, there are 2 options we are looking at very seriously, we meaning my branch, several others. One is photovoltaic on rooftops. Every rooftop would be covered by photovoltaic. You know, whether it's tin rooftop or flat can be done, and we can change the total energy scenario of the country, making it decentralized, which means about 20% wasted will not be wasted, it will be about 3%. So renewable energy is that one. And in the question of climate change, what we have sacrificed in Paris is the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, the principle of CBDR. Instead, we have gone for voluntarism, as I rightly say. In the process, never in the history of mankind, there was any document where a group of countries had to say, we have done it wrong, we'll get it right. That was Climate Convention. That's why it had its impact. Slavery, colonialism, nobody took responsibility, but in climate they did. They realized that that was a tough moral issue for them, economic issue for them. So they have withdrawn from it and destroyed that whole system, gave an excuse called Paris Agreement. And we are all jumping about it in the course of process of incorporating everybody, apart from one half-educated idiot in Washington. But that point all given raises both of those puts input into the inequality that we have. Because Bangladesh, poor population are being greatly affected by disasters, which are enhancing and multiplying rapidly intensity and frequency. Consequently, poverty reduction, which would have happened much faster, is not happening because of this load on disaster. So climate change is coming in multiple and complex ways. And that just shows the inequality. So one of the greatest threats for global inequality is climate change. And what we are seeing now, we have done recent studies in melting of glaciers in the Himalayas. They are melting much faster than any other system around, apart from the polar melting. And consequently, for another 30-40 years, we'll have more water, then we'll run short of water in the whole subcontinent. So crises are real, inequality will increase until unless we can do something about it. And the story doesn't look very pretty, because though you said 1.5 or 2 degrees, the reality is we have probably crossed 2 degrees, not physically. Physically, we were about 0.9 degrees that we have already achieved. We have got for 1.5, 0.6 degrees, for 2, 1.1 degrees. But all calculations show that we will be around 3 to 3.7 degrees by end of the century. Not a pretty thought and not a very sobering thought indeed. So I'll stop there to say that. Thanks again.
Thank you, Atik Bhai. Professor Jomo, any reflections on those comments, observations?
Yes, thank you very much for those very, very helpful comments, because you know the Bangladesh situation better, but many of your comments are also very relevant internationally. I just want to add two points to supplement your very helpful contribution. Firstly, I think, especially since there are colleagues from the FAO here, I think it's very important to distinguish between what are called losses and waste. Okay, so losses very roughly are production losses. So many developing countries, there's a great deal of loss in production. Possibly about a third could be lost in some countries, perhaps less in some other countries, and so on and so forth. And a lot of this has to do with storage facilities and so on and so forth. But there are also other implications. If you look, for example, in countries which are producing products where there are aflatoxin issues involved, if you keep groundnuts, peanuts, in damp conditions, it is very likely aflatoxins will develop. And so even though they cannot sell it for international consumption, their own citizens will be consuming this. And this becomes a public health problem. It's very, very dangerous. And, so I think the whole question of distinguishing between losses and waste is helpful, because the waste problem is a problem of mainly in developed countries. Now, middle-income countries are sort of a bit of both, you know. And I think there are efforts, particularly in Europe, to try to do much, much more in terms of cutting down waste. And some societies have been quite successful in reducing waste, and we are seeing some progress in this regard. Now, the second issue which you raise is about how do we, although you didn't raise it directly, I think there is a question of how do we induce much more investment to scale up investments in renewable energy. And the main way the Europeans have done it, and I think again we can learn from the Europeans, is to use a differentiated feed-in tariff systems. So if you're going to buy, if there is an electricity distributor, say the national electricity distributor in Bangladesh, buys electricity from private sources, you pay a higher price to the generator of electricity using renewable sources than, say, using coal or even diesel. Okay, so by this kind of discrimination, price discrimination, you are able to encourage the private sector to invest much more in using renewable energy, in generating much more renewable energy than they otherwise would. So these are all techniques which have already been successfully implemented in other parts of the world, and which we should learn from, especially as they are relevant to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Barrister Sarah Hussain, you had a question?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much for a really illuminating lecture. I had a question. You mentioned about the rising hunger in Bangladesh, the rising proportion in terms of hungry people. I wondered if you could elaborate a bit on that. And the other question was in terms of your title about inequality. I wondered if you could say a few words about the connections in terms of SDG 16 as well, in terms of the issues around justice and inclusion, and how those might link to the steps that need to be taken around food and energy in terms of people's voice and people's participation, and also the importance of linking the kinds of perhaps demands that you also said that need to continue to be made, for example, around keeping a policy on generic drugs perhaps, or maybe resisting coal-fired power plants, which are not being able to do at the moment in Bangladesh. How would those link with SDG 16, and what would be the kinds of issues we would have to be looking at in terms of the links? Thank you.
Professor Jomo, should I take some questions, or you would like to answer now?
Might be better. Sorry.
No. Okay.
The first question was your first comment. You just speak up. I can hear you.
Yes, sorry, the first question was you mentioned something about the rising proportion of hunger in Bangladesh.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could elaborate on that.
Right. I hesitate to say more because I don't really study Bangladesh closely. So I think you're better off asking my colleagues in the FAO office in Bangladesh why the numbers are like that. But I think ultimately you have to ask Bangladeshis themselves, Bangladeshi researchers, why the numbers seem to be like that. There may be, it might be due to some kind of, it might be due to the international prices affecting domestic prices of food and other factors. I just don't know the answer to that, but that's a very specific empirical question which I hope others in the audience might be able to help with. On the second question on how we interpret SDG 16, if our chairman knows very well, there are many things I have to say about international inequality. But I think what I think is feasible right now is there's very little attention to domestic inequality, and very often the inequality aspects, inequality is interpreted very much with attention to reducing domestic inequality. Very little attention to reducing international inequalities, and I think this is a very major problem. So I've already hinted at what it might involve, and in fact, a full list would take us would take another lecture, okay, at least. Yeah? And there are many people in this audience. I see many old friends and familiar faces, people who know as much as, if not more than I have to contribute on this subject. But I think you're absolutely, I'm very glad you mentioned this because very few people ever mention it. Okay? And it is very important for us to think about the different dimensions. Unfortunately, right now, just looking at the gross economic indicators alone is bad enough, and we don't have much attention being paid to it. But maybe that's why I've become an elder, because I have become quite cynical about many of these measures. I mean, how do we make sense of the fact that poverty seems to have gone down so much and hunger has hardly gone down? Poverty has gone down by about half, it is said, during the MDG period, the last decade and a half, but hunger has only gone down by about less than 20%. How do we understand this? There's something obviously wrong with what we're measuring, right? And we know that for poor people, most of their income they have is spent on food, especially now that very few poor people are involved in food production. Very few people eat their own food, the food they produce themselves. So it is a very serious problem, and it raises very fundamental questions about the indicators which we are using. Okay? And I say that with the liberty of having left the UN system and so on, but I can assure you that when I was in the UN system, I was raising these questions. I was very, very bothered. When I was in New York, I was responsible for compiling the MDG report and so on. But, I had a great deal of difficulty. I'll tell you a story which is quite indicative of how cavalier sometimes the treatment of these. One of the international agencies kept on reporting the same number for maternal deaths. The same number was reported year in and year out. It was the same number. I said, surely the numbers are changing. They said, frankly, we don't know. We honestly don't know. And then one ex-member of that agency went and embarrassed them by getting a few million from Bill Gates and coming up with his own estimates. And it was quite ridiculous. The way the estimates were, there was 342,000, and right to the last digit, this number of maternal deaths in a particular year. How do you get that kind of precision. You're using survey numbers, many countries, the poorest countries where maternal mortality numbers are probably highest, you don't have any numbers at all. You know, one of the things I discovered when I got to the UN was that for 41% of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, there had not been a census for more than 25 years. Okay? I mean, so we are we don't have data on so many things, you know, and the kind of reporting requirements which we are demanding are so high. So I think we have to be much more modest in terms of acknowledging how little we know about the problems we face, and to take many of these numbers with a grain of salt in terms of trying to understand the problems which we are up against. Thank you.
Thank you. Deopriyo, you had a question? We have several guests who will be posing questions, so we will have to be a bit speed up.
I'll be very, very brief. I would like to first join my colleagues in welcoming Jomo in Dhaka once again. And I'd like to take this opportunity to recall that the extraordinary contribution made by Professor Jomo in pushing the knowledge frontier globally by giving substance to the weaker voices in many ways, and wish him luck in his new role within the country which he has taken up. My question is very simple to the speaker, is that on the one hand we are seeing number of positive signals in the global economy. There seems to be a bit of a pickup in this quarter and maybe next, and commodity pressures on commodity prices are again showing up. But at the same time, we see that a number of disturbing trends, trade war in particular, currency war as well, pressures on that, the migration problem, and breakdown of the multilateral system possibly, and withdrawal from the climate change accord in the Paris Accord. So my basic question to you is that, would you agree that all those issues which you have highlighted within the food, the nutrition deficit, the unbalanced mix of energy use, or the growing inequality within the countries or between countries, all these trends are going to exacerbate given the trends which are showing up at this very moment within the world? Or you have talked about the missed opportunities, but is it a greater threat at this moment what we are confronting, and any suggestions on that? Thank you.
Well, the short answer to that very important question, and thank you for the comments preceding that. The short answer is that I would say that we have a very mixed world, that the trends are moving in different directions. On some things there certainly has been progress. On some things there has not been progress. But very often saying something like that is so banal, you know. It doesn't really capture the complexity of these trends. And so I tend to hesitate from making any big generalizations, you know. But I think your question really underscores how complex the world situation is, and how, in a sense, options are changing all the time. I mean, let me give you a simple example, okay? Some of you may know, because I think I published an article together with my colleague Anis Chowdhury I think it was in the Daily Star. Anyway, it was in a Bangladesh paper about the relevance of the TPP for Bangladesh, whether you can what lessons there are. Now, it's very interesting that the debate has changed so fundamentally in the last year and a half because of the election of President Trump. And he's raising the kinds of attitudes he's taken, while quite destructive of trade multilateralism, which you were involved with and so on, at the same time supports many of our old arguments. Okay? And I'll give you one specific example. Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. trade representative, has actually argued. Lighthizer has actually argued that the U.S. will not accept the TPP or the new version of it, which is called the CPTPP, because it undermines American sovereignty by allowing other countries to challenge American courts. Okay? because the TPP includes a clause for what is called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. In other words, a company can sue a government and that matter can be resolved through private arbitration. Okay? And there are basically less than 300 lawyers who basically take turns. It's like musical chairs, you know. One moment you are a judge, one moment you are representing one of the parties. And this is the kind of situation which the Obama administration was pushing for. They wanted ISDS, and now Lighthizer, the Trump administration, is saying it undermines American sovereignty. What about the rest of us? It undermines the sovereignty of all other countries as well, you know. But our leaders were quite happy to concede that kind of sovereignty. I mean, just imagine the TTIP, which was for US and Europe. They were basically saying that the European courts were not to be trusted. Okay, and therefore you needed to have these ISDS provisions. So we are seeing a world which is very, very new in a sense, where many of the where many of the arguments many of us were making in the past are now being legitimized by people we would not normally want to be working with. You know, so I think being adept and trying to adjust quickly to this new world, I think is a very, very important challenge for us as we try to negotiate our way through it. And recognizing that trends are often quite complex and often with dimensions which can be positive, but also with other dimensions which may well be negative, and often for reasons which we have very little control over.
Thank you, Professor Jomo. I will now bring Mr. Harunur Rashid, Executive Director, BPSS, and then I will request Professor Raunak Jahan to put her question. Yes, Mr. Rashid.
Thank you very much. This is a very extraordinary presentations. And exactly what I would like to say, I am representing from the part of my disabled community in Bangladesh. And exactly I have experience to visit in Malaysian University MAP MAP University in Malaysia. But one thing that our government signed and ratified UNCRPD, UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But still today, we, the persons with disabilities, we are left behind and facing food security, inequality, and exactly the persons with disabilities are yet to be included in the development process. Do you think, what's your ideas, including your countries, how address the disability issues in regarding the fact, and what the steps need to be implemented for that purpose? Exactly, I want to know. That is my first questions. And second question is that regarding diabetics and other diseases, especially the persons with disabilities are not even capable to work, and even in most cases moving ability, and exactly how we overcome the situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. My mother spent much of her life working in the school for blind children, so I'm very, very involved, perhaps more than most people, in questions such as this. So I have a tendency to speak too long on these subjects, but given the number of hands which have been put up, I have to be very short. I have to say that although there has been some progress over the decades in Malaysia, progress is very modest. I live very near a community of blind people. Their work options now are very, very limited. In the old days, many of them could aspire to become telephone operators and so on. Now their options are even more limited, and the main work option basically for blind people tends to be work as masseurs, and even then the training for masseurs tends to be rather poor, and as a consequence, many people are not even using the blind for this. With other disabilities, the issues are quite different. But I think it is. I think for a country which claims to be moving into high income status and so on, I would say that Malaysia has to do much more than is currently the case. There are some very high achievers, and one of my former colleagues, Ismail Saleh, who unfortunately passed away about a decade ago. Ismail was a PhD economist, and I often say that he could see what most economists were blind about. He showed in his analysis that the impact of the tax system was not only regressive in Malaysia, contrary to what most people presume, but actually had become even more regressive over time. And this was something which Ismail showed many years ago. So there have been very exceptional cases of very considerable achievements, but it begs the question of what the vast majority of people living with disabilities face. And the numbers are actually quite high and tend to be underestimated officially. So we don't even have very good numbers, and we don't have enough of an official effort to try to address these challenges. But thank you very much for raising that. As far as some of the other programs are concerned, you are right. I think there has to be greater sensitivity. Where I live happens to be one area which is quite sensitive to the presence of a lot of people who are visually handicapped. But the vast majority of the population also needs to be much more educated in terms of becoming much more sensitive to the needs of people with different abilities. So thank you for raising it.
Thank you, Professor Jomo. Professor Raunak Jahan. And then I will bring Dr. Asaduzaman.
Okay. In certain areas, such as energy, you identified some negative developments, but at the same time, some positive developments, such as photovoltaic, that we can focus on. What I'm wondering that in terms of the global will to address many of the challenges, the messages that we all get, and you also elaborated on them, are all negative developments. So what I would like to hear from you is whether you can identify, in terms of the global will to address some of these challenges, some positive areas or some positive developments that you see, because I think many of us are feeling very depressed, and I would like to leave this lecture feeling a little happy if I can see some silver lining. Thank you.
Well, let me just take two related to what I talked about. One was the whole question of food. As the first commentator from the floor pointed out, there is greater awareness of problems of food waste as well as food losses. And undoubtedly, the kinds of initiatives, particularly by civil society, for example, in the West, have been very encouraging. And in fact, now, in many, even in developing countries, you find, for example, various efforts by civil society groups to try to make sure that there is much less waste. As far as food losses in production are concerned, unfortunately, there's very little progress there. On the other question, and people are also increasingly aware of food safety issues and nutrition issues. Slowly, we find that there is greater awareness of these issues. Now, as far as energy is concerned, I think particularly in the case of Bangladesh, because of how it affects Bangladesh in very profound and extended ways, the impact is very, very. People are aware of the issues. I would not say the same thing of many countries, and I think. I think, for example, making some progress on renewable energy is relatively easy to do in Bangladesh, partly because this does not involve government effort alone. Government can work with the private sector to mobilize much more investments. All it has to do is to create the correct incentives. So the incentives which are being done right now in terms of subsidizing the price of petrol for car owners is something which can easily be redirected for other purposes. And I feel that there is much more discussion and awareness in Bangladesh about many issues which probably you take for granted here. But where you are actually well ahead of the rest of the world because of the vibrancy of public discussion in this country. I remember, for example, when CPD organized the discussion on public enterprises, and that was I do not know, and I've been very active on the whole question of state-owned enterprises for decades. And some of you who read my series in the Interpress service are aware that I've been writing continuously on this. But that there is a much greater level of awareness of those kinds of issues in Bangladesh than in much of the rest of the world. So I think it's important. The whole point of my lecture is to encourage you to do more on both those fronts. I did not mean to depress you, and so, Professor, if I did so, that was certainly unintended. But
global public will that you mentioned was much higher, or global will to address some of these challenges in the 1970s as opposed to now. So what are the forces where you can identify that can again address or be united? You have mentioned South's own setup. So all the multinational institutions, global civil society, so how can those voices be strengthened, or do you see some positive developments there? So that was my question.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question, but frankly, on that question, I must admit I share your pessimism. I have very little grounds for optimism on that particular issue. President Trump has accelerated the decline of multilateralism. But what disappoints me more is the European response. I had hoped that there would, in the old days, it was the Europeans who were always consistently pushing for multilateralism, especially including after the end of the Cold War. But now I don't see that anymore. The Europeans have bypassed the World Trade Organization and undermine multilateralism in other ways as well. Of course, there are differences among European countries, but by and large, that has probably adversely affected the situation. So without a strong European commitment to multilateralism, and without strong developing country commitments, and with the emergence of the BRICS has been a double-edged sword. While the BRICS, on the one hand, have been able to articulate certain things more forcefully, by and large, they have left the other developing countries behind, and there is a tendency to since there are BRICS and G20 and other arrangements where the other developing countries are out of the picture, unfortunately, this is a major problem. I know that my Prime Minister is going to the UN General Assembly later this month to address the General Assembly, and I know how strongly he feels about these kinds of issues. But my fear is that his speech may well fall on deaf ears, given the situation which we face in the world today.
Thank you, Professor Jomo. We will have to round it up pretty quickly. We are also looking forward to hearing the reflections of Professor Rehman Sobhan on the lecture which was delivered. So I will now take 3 questions and then Professor Jomo will answer at one go. Dr. Asaduzzaman and then Major General Amsa Amin and then Professor Aminul Karim and Dr. Morshid. So these 4 questions and please, yes, okay, I will bring you. So questions have to be very short. I don't dare to guide our professor whether the answers will be short, but we'll have to round it up. Thank you.
Well, I am forewarned. But let me tell you, Professor Jomo, there is a Bengali proverb which says, Sharbonge gha molom lagabo kothay. The English translation is, if you have wound all over the body, where do you put the ointment? It's something like this. The interconnected issues that you have discussed, and some of those really having perhaps the dangers of butterfly effect. Something small happening in some sector will create a very large disturbance in another. And I think in that sense, as Professor Raunak Jahan said earlier, where is the entry point? See, so many things we have to do. Where is the entry point? Are we trying to do everything together? Do we have the institutional capacity for doing this? The other day I had been looking at the second National Plan of Action for Nutrition. It's a huge document, and 20 to 25 ministries are involved, and if one looks at it, who will have to do what, one gets completely bogged down. Apparently it seems that nothing perhaps can be done. Can we find out only a few major avenues of investment, intervention, or whatever you want to call it, which will do the trick? And then if we can get to a level, then we get to the finer points. Can we do that? Just this question.
Thank you. General Amsa Amin. Taratak then. Yes.
Thank you, sir. I'm Amsa Amin, a retired general and an ambassador. I attend all the CPD presentations. I think I have very thoroughly enjoyed your talk, Professor Jomo. I'll not spend time on protocol anymore. You have raised some very complex issues, not only global, but also for internal Bangladesh issues. All these are. You talked about the Western world taking away all the money meant for the developing world to manage 2008 financial crisis. And now the debate has shifted with Trump. Why do we go globally? I don't think we can really depend much in what the world can do for us. My commentary is that countries like us, developing countries, have to depend on themselves. Now, the major issue is what Professor Asaduzzaman talked about. Where do we start? Each of these subjects is very complex for Bangladesh internally. You ended with the question of financial outflows. Although we have very small financial world, but we have major outflows as well. We have trillions of dollars, which came out very recently in the media, had flowed out to Singapore. And we have a major banking crisis in this country.
Question, please.
How do we deal with these kind of issues? And then a question about internal equality. I wonder if you know, in this country, we have districts, we have 64 districts. Some districts have just about 2-3% people below poverty line. And some districts have 71% people below poverty line. How do you tackle this kind of inequality within the country? And the last point, which you, of course, did not touch upon, and I don't know whether it's very relevant or not, where do countries like us stand in participating in the information technology revolution, and whether we can use it for our benefit?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Aminul Karim. We'll appreciate if you could be quick, please.
Quick question, sir. Yeah, short question. I'm Aminul Karim. I work in University of Malaya, sir, as you were the faculty there once upon a time. Yeah. My question is, Bangladesh is growing very fast in the GDP growth rate. We have crossed 7%, our next target is 8%. But at the same time, our unemployment is also growing very fast. So what is the quiz or the puzzle in that? Why it cannot tackle or arrest this problem when we are growing so fast? Our next target is 8% growth rate. Your suggestions on that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Morshid Bhai, Doctor.
Thank you.
Yes, Morshid.
Morshid from BIDS.
BIDS.
First of all, I think congratulate you for trying to address three extremely challenging issues. But of course, the last one is the most challenging, inequality. But first of all, as an observer of the food security situation in Bangladesh for a long time, I thought I must sort of say that actually, in terms of the evidence that we have so far, in terms of availability of food, particularly cereals and rice, we have done very well. And therefore, this notion that hunger is rising is, I don't know where it comes from, and I suggested that we talk to FAO about it. This is, in fact, the first time I've heard of this, because if poverty is decreasing, and cereals are much more available today, hardcore poverty is very relatively quite small. It's difficult to understand how hunger could be increasing. But what, of course, remains the problem, is the next generation problem, is the problem of malnutrition, problem of micronutrient deficiencies, and so on and so forth. Even in those terms, there have been some progress, but a lot needs to be done. But that seems to be basically something that we're looking for in terms of a technology fix, because that seems to be the predominant strategy these days, maybe because of the influence of multinationals here. It needs to be investigated. But in terms of a homegrown solution, this is not really in sight. So a lot of work would need to be done on that sector. On the energy front, I think we've done, again, quite well, particularly for renewables. But now renewables are now on the recession, particularly because grid electricity fed by fossil fuels are making very serious headway into the countryside. So renewables are now, quite on the defensive. So there is a problem there. Inequality, I think that's anybody's guess how that is going to be addressed. But basically here, I think the role of subsidies is something that keeps coming up, and I wonder whether you have any particular position on subsidies and vis-a-vis the role of the free market. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ali Ahmed, the CEO of Bangladesh Foreign Trade Institute, the last question, and we then can round up.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving me this scope. I'll not waste my time by praising the quality of the lecture, which has been profusely praised all around, and I totally share in it. And after the questions by such an erudite listeners, I am left with very little. But I would like to agree with Mr. Morshed, Dr. Morshed, about this food. I think there has been some misinformation that food production has gone down or food distribution. This has to be looked into, although there are some problems in distribution aspect. But my main question, I'd like to concentrate only on inequality. We all know that economists are not wizards. They cannot just do away with inequality by wishing it. But inequality, there are many ways of addressing this. Internationally, this can be addressed by pumping in capital. This is one thing, the traditional way, but also inwardly, inside. From outside, we can get capitals. From inside, taxation is one, and then endowments by the state is another. Endowments very often end up in wrong hands. Instead of reducing inequality, it sometimes creates more. Taxation, we know this regressive and progressive and this indirect taxes and all those things. Here, you should have perhaps touched upon, but because of shortage of time, the quality of governance often fails to materialize the well-intentioned measures of progressive taxation. You cannot often reach the people from whom you are supposed to collect taxes because of their political clout, because they often control the parliament, the government, and all those. Not only in this country, in countries like this. So I think this is an area which should be very seriously looked into if we at all care about this inequality, because it is increasing, that is true. Although wealth is increasing, equality is increasing too. I think you could have touched this. Thank you very much.
Professor Jomo. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this rich array of questions. Obviously, given the time available, even though the chairman has been very generous, I will try to be as disciplined as I can be. If I can go in reverse order, on the question of inequality, my intention was to simply emphasize that there is an international dimension to inequality, which many people tend to ignore when they talk about inequality. That was the sole intention of my purpose. So the domestic inequality, I completely agree with you that there are many debates around that, and we can move on from there. My point is that there's an international dimension of inequality which has gone through many different phases, and that was the intention to bring it up. As far as subsidies are concerned, I think my attitude about subsidies is basically the following. If we give subsidies, governments give subsidies all the time. They call them incentives when they're giving to the rich, when they're giving to companies and so on. Investment incentives, this incentive, that incentive, and so on. But when it comes to the poor, because they have very little influence and so on, we agonize over it. So I have a very if we take when I was in the FAO, we had a program called From Protection to Production. We were arguing for social protection because we found considerable evidence, mainly from Africa, I must admit, because that was where the studies were done, which showed that when people had their basic needs covered, any additional subsidy income that they had went into production, into enhancing their productive capacities. So this view that subsidizing the poor only goes into consumption and there is no additionality in terms of production is actually wrong, at least for the countries where we have done surveys. And apparently the Latin American literature also suggests the same. So I think what we lack in Asia is studies of this type. Maybe Asians are different, maybe it's not true, but I think we need to investigate this question. On the question of whether you can have increased food supply and you can have hunger, as you know, in the United States, there is still quite a bit of hunger. But you also have undoubtedly huge increases in food supply. So the coexistence of increased food supply and rising hunger. I'm not trying to defend the FAO numbers, but I think it is very important to recognize that the question of food supply and increasing food supply can be very different. And the FAO indices or indicators for food insecurity involve not just food supply or availability, but also affordability and a number of other criteria. So I don't really know the answer to your question, but I think this is a very important question to study. Now, The question of why do you have growth and unemployment, frankly, I cannot answer that question because I don't know enough about the Bangladesh economy to answer that question. But there are many countries where you have growth without increasing unemployment. And this is something which is not so anomalous, but it's a very important question to investigate as well. Now, what can... on IT options, again, this is a very specific question to Bangladesh. I really cannot answer that question. The question of the general raised the question of outflows, and you may be interested to know about 3 years ago. There was a letter in the Financial Times in response to many people who were saying, all this money is going from developing countries to Swiss banks. According to this writer who was from Africa, he said that the number one tax haven in the world today is no longer Switzerland. I mean, that's not where, where you have secret bank accounts. It's not Switzerland anymore. Actually, Singapore has emerged, okay? So the question, I think there is a real problem. That's why I quoted the late James Putucherry, who pointed out that it is an illusion, it's a delusion to think that by opening up that there more capital will flow in. So I think you have to get rid of that kind of perception, but it's also important to encourage Bangladeshis with money to invest in the economy. And there are opportunities which I've tried to identify, both in terms of food as well as energy, where this might be done. The other question which was raised was on entry points. What kinds of entry points? What do we prioritize? And quite honestly, I don't know enough about the situation in Bangladesh today to answer that question. But I do think that very often there is no need to rank certain things, I mean, there is as you know, about 4 months ago, there was a change of government in Malaysia. After 61 years of rule by the ruling party, a new government came in 4 months ago. And they had about 10 priorities, okay? And they've worked on those 10 priorities, and they found that they could not make progress on all those 10 priorities. And they have about 2/3 of them have been prioritized, but other issues they have not been able to prioritize. But in my own engagement as a member of this council, what we have done is to work on about 5 of those 10 priorities, where we have come up with immediate we've come up with proposals for the government to consider, but we've also added in a number of things. So, for example, on the question of subsidies for the poor, there are in existence multiplicity, almost 100 different types of subsidies already exist for the poor. What we have tried to do is to rationalize them. Likewise with incentives, we have found that there are so many fiscal incentives which have accrued over the last 60 years. First to encourage certain types of industries and so on and so forth. And these incentives add up and add up and add up. There's no rationalization and so on. So what we're trying to do is to rationalize on the incentive side as well as on the subsidy side, and to try to ensure that the subsidies are much more effective. We also are not very keen on targeting. Targeting often suffers from 2 problems. One, you have people who should not be benefiting, who often get included because they somehow or other qualify under criteria. And then more dangerously, there are many people who are deserving, so unless the mode of targeting is very simple, okay, otherwise I really don't think there is need for that amount of targeting. So there are many things which can be done, and I don't see a need to say, oh, if you are going to act on 10 things, you can only do one at a time, or two at a time, or something like that. I think it is often necessary to do quite a number of different reforms simultaneously. And of course, when the reforms are related, somebody said something, I think you said something about nutrition. There are so many ministries which are involved. For me, I'm encouraged in the case of Bangladesh, because you have agriculture minister who has been quite reform-minded over the years, and so on, and much can be done with her engagement. So it's when it's not only the one ministry which has responsibility, then the Prime Minister or the President of a country needs to take responsibility. So in the case of Tanzania, for example, it is precisely because the previous President took responsibility for nutrition that you had an all-of-government effort. So it's often you do need this kind of all-of-government effort in order to give that kind of push. But it doesn't mean that just because you work on nutrition, you don't have to work on energy. Just because you work on energy, you don't work on international trade or something like that. Often they are complementary, and even if they are not complementary, there's no reason why one should be prioritized and the others. Of course, when you have limited resources, you have to prioritize, and that is much more of a dilemma. But many of the things I'm proposing do not involve resource constraints. They do not run up against resource constraints, and that's why, mindful of Bangladesh's relatively poorer status, I came up with these priorities in making the proposal for today's lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jomo, and dear audience, thank you very much for being so active. So this time around, a big hand to the audience. And dear guests, we have also reached through our live streaming thousands of people who have been witnessing and enjoying this very vibrant session, and we have reached Professor Jomo, many others who are not here, but through our live streaming thousands of people have hooked into our system, and they have also enjoyed your presentation and the lively discussion that we had, but they couldn't ask you questions, so that's a loss. So thank you very much. We will now hear from Professor Rehman Sobhan. Professor Rehman Sobhan's collaboration with Professor Jomo goes back many, many years, as Professor Jomo has mentioned, so it will be very nice to hear from Professor Rehman Sobhan. And before that, I request our Executive Director to help with some of the ceremonial things, the token of appreciation to Professor Jomo. So, sir.
It gives me great pleasure to receive Jomo here again. He is now part of a council of elders established by the newly elected Prime Minister, who is a mere youthful 93. So in those circumstances, I can say that I have known Jomo over a period of time where he would have been classified as part of the Council of Youngers, going back to the early 80s. And that would have been a time where I doubt very much if the present Prime Minister, who was also the Prime Minister at that time, would actually have invited Jomo to be a member of any council at all, because in those early years, and this has not really left him, as we have seen from his presentation, he was part of a very rare breed in the Malaysian professional community. He was a progressive, dissenting thinker and economist. When I used to visit Malaysia in those days, I knew quite a lot of your fellow economists, but very few who would in fact take a much more sort of progressive and dissenting perspective on the way in which they were addressing the problems of their country. And so I became specially attached to Jomo, and through him got to know a wider circle of progressive people in the Malaysia of those days, who now I'm happy to see are much more mainstream in the way that Jomo is, and it is a reflection on the political evolution in Malaysia that in fact these transitions over the years have actually taken place. Raunak Jahan, who was at that time director of the gender program in the Asia Pacific Development Center in Kuala Lumpur, remembers seeking him out to do professional work for her, because she was one of the few people who she saw was likely to have sort of innovative and dissenting views. So this was a relationship which evolved over the years, and in fact when CPD was established at the end of 1993, one of the first major international conferences we organized, it was a very formidable event at that time. We called it Learning from East Asia, Lessons for South Asia. Jomo was one of the people that we invited to come and be one of the special speakers. He may or may not remember, but a number of major East Asian scholars, Robert Wade, Hajun Chang, in fact Justin Yu-Fu Ling, who became the chief economist of the World Bank from China, all came to attend that conference. And what was unique about that conference was, of course, that this was in July of 1996. It was the very first public event attended by the then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina after being elected Prime Minister and returning to office with her party after a lapse of 21 years. It was a very historic occasion for us that her very first public appearance was at that particular conference. I remember she was there naturally as the chief guest. The late Mr. Shamsul Kibriya, who was her finance minister, in fact was there, and the other person who joined Jomo to speak at the inaugural session was again the former finance minister, the late Saifur Rehman. Unfortunately, Dr. Kibriya was assassinated 2004, and some years later Saifur Rehman died in a car crash. So in fact, you are, in that sense, part of a historic memory for us. And in fact, we greatly appreciate that. And of course, then a few years later, when the World Bank was presenting its report on bureaucrats and in business, which was, of course, attempting to carry out their international drive to wind up the public sector. And they were wanting to do a sort of showcase conference over here. We, in fact, had a very interesting and challenging conference where much of the then cabinet, this was about 1998, and the business community, everyone else was there, but we were really exposing that report to a very professional analysis. And the one person I thought of who I could bring over to share the Malaysian and East Asian experience and how they dealt with their public enterprises was Jomo. So these were areas in which we interacted. But of course now, as with all good things, positive things do happen in the world, and Jomo evolved into the international community and became a global, he was a well-known global academic, but he got into a position where he could in fact influence the global discourse through the UN system and then through FAO. And of course we have had some exposure now to the formidable accumulation of experience and some of his direct interventions in trying to influence the international debate. And of course, as an outcome, now he is here as a member of a council of elders. Hopefully, this time is not a dissenting economist, but as an elder. You will be exercising more influence over a government which in fact has come into office after an interregnum of 61 years in which an incumbent party was in office. So the compulsion to be innovative and creative and to be receptive to ideas from both elders and youngers would presumably be a lot greater today, and we will all be looking to Malaysia with great interest in reading your blogs to see in fact how far this is actually being carried through. Now, I don't think I want to follow up on the discussion at all. I think this was a tour de force, and I would share much of what Jomo had to say. I would merely, in a way, try to raise a point with you, which may be of some relevance now that you are also part of a council of elders, which I would see as a positive element. That whilst the world is now in a very peculiar and you may say a sort of regressive phase in our global history, there are some very significant changes in the objective conditions of the global order, which did not exist once upon a time when the whole issue of the debates on the new international economic order and South-South cooperation were going on in the course of the 70s. I was involved in that in various ways. But today, there has been a complete restructuring in global competitiveness. And the center of global competitiveness and the capacity to then project this in terms of generating global capital surpluses has relocated itself from the West to Asia. And this is a very unique set of circumstances. It briefly occurred in the 1970s when the oil exporting countries generated surpluses, but that was rapidly dissipated and it didn't have a future because it was a commodity. Today, virtually the restructuring of the global economy has reflected outcomes of the way in which global competitiveness is relocated. And the reactive responses are now manifesting itself particularly in the most advanced country and in Europe, where actually all their responses are to in fact really reverse what has been a structural change in the global economy and to take much more protective responses to in fact deal with this. So the challenge to you, hopefully in your capacity to be able to influence your Prime Minister, is to in fact try to see how far he can contribute and use his mature years and long experience, to move towards the creation of an Asian community. In the 1980s, I was invited by Nuruddin Sopi, the founder of ISIS, the organization where you were for 2 years a visiting professor. We member what he called the Commission for a New Asia, in which you were doing advanced thinking. Sabura Kita was the chair of that commission. And the idea was to see how the emerging strengths of Asia could in fact be collectively mobilized to bring about a rebalancing in the world order. But now the situation is far more advanced than that. And the strength of the Asian economies, led by China certainly, but also now India as a major force, is huge. And the surpluses of the world which are underwriting the deficits of the United States today have emerged as one of the major resources to in fact sustain the realization of many of the issues that you've raised over here. The issues of malnutrition, the issues of bringing about a more efficient and just utilization of energy, and of bringing about a much more equitable world order. So these are all objective transformations which have taken place in the global arena. The big problem of when we were preparing the reports of that commission was, of course, that at the end you may find many of the strong objective reasons for bringing about a much more integrated Asian community. But at the end, the concept, Asia itself as a concept is an abstraction. And so, in order to respond to these new circumstances which emerged, what you now need are Asian statesmen and statesmen entrepreneurs who are in fact going to invoke these new change realities and reach out to other leaders in Asia to in fact really try to recreate a world order in which we no longer need to depend on the exclusive dynamics of the sort of traditional power bases over here, but can in fact actually dictate our own agendas and can in fact rebalance the world even if some elements of it choose to withdraw, because under those circumstances, if such a powerful entity acting together and acting in a more creative way is setting its own agendas, there is no way in which the rest of the world who are opting out can in fact stay behind. It is only in a much more fragmented order that they have the traditional authority to do what they are doing. So I would hope that as the elder statesman amongst the leaders of Asia, your Prime Minister in his, sort of final incarnation, will in fact not just see himself as a Malaysian leader trying to recreate a new order in Malaysia, but will reach out to people and ask them to see whether Asia can now emerge as its rightful place as one of the sort of major contributors to the emergence of a new and more just globalized world. I say this in great hope and expectation, and he has a acceptability in the Asian region which is probably quite unique at the moment, which would enable him to reach out to contending forces in India on the one side and China on the other, and that would be a role that he could in fact come to play in the international system in these last years. I don't know if in fact this is part of, I'm 83 years old, but whether I can still continue to be a romantic in terms of my expectations for the future, I do not know. But I remain one, and I would want to invite you to share that romanticism and to, in fact, see what you can, in fact, do about it to take it forward.
Dear audience, thank you very much for your patience. We really had a very enlightened discussion. I'd now like to request you and invite you to have coffee, tea and coffee with us. Thank you.